Hello and welcome to another podcast of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, today I'm going to discuss a topic that hasn't happened yet because one of the natures of recording this podcast and event is that we record it prior to them being released. Obviously, it's not a live show. So, in this particular episode, I want to talk about what seems at this point to be an inevitability, which is at some point, scientists sooner or later are going to come up with the vaccine for COVID-19. That is inevitable. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I'm looking back through some of the prior episodes that we've recorded to just kind of wrap my head around what the church's teachings would be. So, to make a reference to a prior episode, is we had a discussion about essentially medicine as an individual that you are responsible to take and that you have the right to decline. And to summarize that entire episode, it basically boiled down to if in reasonable times you can expect a reasonable degree of certainty and a positive outcome that an eighth grader can administer, you should take it. So some examples were you should eat. It's reasonable that an eighth grader can make you a sandwich. You should be able to drink water, basic antibiotics because that's a reasonable expectation that they will help you. So then I look into other examples, and we have vaccines all around us that work very well. For the most part, aside from a couple of blips in the Northwest, measles and the mumps are gone. Polio doesn't exist in America because of vaccines and stuff of that nature. So, but we also are not required to take the flu shot every year. That's kind of optional, and the faith recognizes that. So I bring this up here for the COVID situation because looking around the country and at the various governors giving their speeches, while they change very frequently and sometimes even within their own sentence in which they're telling you a policy, it does seem that some of them are pretty much going to mandate their citizens to return to economic life to have proof that they've had this vaccine. And to me, that is the fear that seems wrong when it becomes a pure mandate. But then again, going back to what I just said a couple seconds ago, we do have vaccines for various different diseases that we don't even think of anymore. And going into the last episode, kind of eliminating hardships from our lives. So that's the conversation I'm coming from. And I brought out data, and I don't want to diminish and say that COVID didn't kill people or it's not deadly or anything like that. So I went on the internet to try to find evidence on that side of the fence. And there's only really two states, and there's no federal data that really kind of shows what I was looking for, which was on a month-to-month basis, looking strictly at this time frame from when we were this month to this month over a couple of years, how many more people died overall versus corona? Because the suspicion I had was the same amount of people died, they just died from something different. But when I looked at particular statistics, and the two states that put it up was New Jersey and Michigan, if you look in April in particular, both of them had significant increases over their prior 5-year average, which did mean that corona significantly increase the amount of people that had passed away in that state. In the case of New Jersey, it was 3 times as many compared to their average of April for the prior 5 years. So it's significant. But then as you fast forward now to June and July, we're right back to where the average was, and it has returned to normalness. So from that fact, you can make an argument either way depending upon how you'd like to spin it. So that's the issue that I have here, is that we see that depending upon what state you live in, your governor might force you to take this pill or this drug. And if you're not, you don't have to do anything. And again, it's just something that they keep changing their minds. So whether this actually becomes a direct rule or not, we'll get to see, let alone where. But it's something that, as far as a core concept, I'd like to get us and our audience ready for as we're approaching what I believe to be a scientific inevitability that we're going to come up with a cure. And basically my question is, then what?
Wow, well, you did a lot of work to prepare that, and you presented that so clearly. Thanks for really spelling all that out with the from the details of the data to some of the background in terms of using medical interventions and the morality of that, whether it's morally obligatory or not. And uh, excellent summary. Really appreciate all that you did, and I think it's a testimony too. You'll be the first to tell people you're not a theologian, and this is not your your daily work. But between our podcasts, you asking good questions in the past, and those podcasts are all available for people, and some basic internet data searches to find out some details. Any of our listeners could do this, and I just want to give you credit for that and hold you up as an example to say, uh, we need to do this. We need to actually, these are serious decisions that we're making. And the way that we tend to make serious decisions is looking around to see what everybody else is doing or listening to some pundits on Fox News on the one hand or CNN on the other hand, and listening to our favorite people. And there is certainly a value. Obviously, people are listening to us too, but we want to inform our consciences and then make good decisions, reasonable decisions. And so, anyway, I just give you a lot of credit for taking the time to do that. You weren't doing that just for a podcast. You're doing that because you're thinking ahead and you actually care and you want to make good decisions that are in line with the truth, which we have a certain special access to because of our faith and the teaching of the church. So, yeah, fantastic. And um, we may follow up on this episode. I'm not a moral theologian, and so kind of the analysis that you already made is about the analysis that I would make. But I also think the question about being forced to take vaccines probably has been dealt with. There are often a couple, some nuances that I'm just thinking off the top of my head may overlook, and so I want to even just follow up on that. It's been on my mind, and I haven't been forced to confront it yet, and so I haven't done the kind of research that you did and looking back at it. But uh, even the question of whether you can be forced to take vaccines by the government is an interesting question. And I feel like the Supreme Court has upheld the right of parents not to administer vaccines to their children. But then the state can also withhold certain services. Like if you're not going to give vaccines to your children, then they can't go to public schools. That there's a little bit of that kind of thing. But just being forced straight up to actually administer vaccines, I think is not even something that our government will do. Our government, which would not be as closely tied in with the moral law necessarily as we might be in terms of our reflection on Catholic teachings. So, um, but you apply the right criteria, Joe, in saying that we make the distinction between ordinary means and extraordinary means of medical intervention, and uh, whether an eighth grader could prepare it. I'm not sure if I use that metric, but it's a good one. It's universally um, available, and the question comes up. Kind of the border question is about taking an IV for nutrition and hydration, and basically that IV could be administered at home and it's a very low cost. And so that falls into ordinary means in the United States, but that's an area where even, if you were in a, I don't know, some place that was more third world, and even the IV equipment would not be as available or could be more expensive, it might move that into a different category. The basic point is you need to feed people and give them water to drink by available means, as long as that's not going to cause them worse damage. That's where putting a feeding tube in someone could actually end up killing them, depending on how weakened their condition is. You're not required to force a feeding tube in if that's going to be the case. But in normal circumstances, with someone who's in a persistent vegetative state, who's not getting any worse, they don't have any pathology, they just have had a significant amount of brain damage or whatever it is that's preventing them from coming out of a coma, and they're in that state of being, you have to keep feeding them. You can't just kill them off by starving them to death. I mean, that's the basic point. But then on the other hand, just to make the categories clear, forcing someone to take chemotherapy, there's nothing that's ordinary about chemotherapy. It's poison in your body. It's destroying you. It's expensive. It requires doctors to prescribe and regulate and all of that. You're never required to do that or to have open heart surgery or some other extreme measure. That's not a moral requirement. So what about a vaccine? And this is where medical knowledge is also important. And I don't have all of that handy, but one of the places that this comes up is there are a couple of serious concerns about vaccines. The I'm not going to get the details right, but I'm close. So the MMR, the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine, coupled together as a triple, was developed from the lines of aborted fetal cells. I'm pretty sure I'm right about those details. And so, is someone required to use research and use a product that was developed through an immoral means in order to administer that to their child? And the answer is no. So even the Supreme Court upholds that right. Certainly, our Catholic faith upholds that right, that you're not required to use um, something that's developed through an evil means. Is it possible to use it? Uh, well, it's material cooperation, and then you have to weigh a number of different factors in making that decision. But some may come to the decision in conscience that they can't do that, and we would accept that. Now, it's possible to get mumps, measles, and rubella separately. They have those vaccines separated out. They're developed in a moral way, and people can use those instead. And it's a little more expensive, and some are more rare. And I don't remember all the details. This is all from. I have a friend who runs a pediatrics center that's Catholic out in Arizona, so I got some of these details from that. But um, so those are a lot of different factors to take into account. There are also some real concerns about the levels of mercury that are in a lot of vaccines, and administering high levels of mercury to children under the age of, I don't remember what it is, a few weeks or a few months. Those things turn out to be complicated and have a higher correlation with autism or something like that. And so there's a lot of secondary factors. We sort of like create this black box and we say vaccine prevents disease, all good. And it's more complicated than that. The delivery system, exposing people to a virus that is not necessary, could actually get the symptoms and get sick from it. They could die from it. People have serious reactions to the flu. So it's not so black and white as to say, if you take this thing, this is, the result, you're immune and you prevent all of this other stuff from happening. And so I think because of that, those levels of uncertainty, the church would not say this is morally obligatory. Now, there might be some special circumstances where you really have something that's extremely destructive, and I don't know but it would be a balancing of certain factors that uh, you have to take a certain risk because there are a lot of other people that are at risk if you don't do this. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. That's why I say somebody else has really thought through this more than I have, and I would appeal to their more thorough moral analysis. But maybe it at least gives our listeners a sense of, there are some complexities involved. Certainly, the answer is not simply yes or no, and there's a decision in conscience, and that conscience would be protected also by our constitutional rights. And so it's worth looking at more carefully, and I can research it more, and we can present it, or at least have some links to somebody else who's done the investigation more thoroughly, for the sake of our listeners. But hopefully that at least sketches out the territory there.
And certainly, this is still theoretically a ways off. I mean, we don't know when the vaccine is coming, but we do know that from the standpoint of morals, they don't change just because of someone's opinion 3 days from now. Just because Trump sends a tweet, that's not going to change what the church's stance is. It's going to stay the same. So, with that being said, a couple of things came out from what you said. So, the first is the nuance. In general, the majority of our culture is designed to avoid nuances and details. We are a clickbait society at this point, and that is something that has turned the corner, more so with each generation as you look back in time. That being said, going in and finding out the correct features of a certain situation are important. But that does bring me to a secondary thing, is what we talked about with prudence, is there is a certain level when we have an obligation to go out and learn more. That was part of learning more about, in that particular episode, was learning about God, but learning about moral questions is still one and the same, and why the teaching is there, because ultimately you're going to get to some truth that through an inevitable logic will get you to God. I mean, in some ways it boils down to there. To take a very simple one you just gave me right there, the vaccine that was created from fetuses, the church is against abortions because they kill life, and therefore that is directly correlated to the teachings of God. Pretty straightforward and streamlined there. Now, as you said before, there's no such thing as everything being perfectly black and white. There's always going to be a trade-off at some degree, whether it be a very obvious one or a very significant one. Those will vary. That's just a fact of life. I mean, you can boil it down to a simple rule of physics. You can only be in one place at one time. You can't be in two places at once. So, take a simple choice. You can either eat the blue or the red, the blue pill or the red pill. You can't do both. It's which one are you doing? So that being said, it brings me to a second question from what you brought up there, which was this vaccine in this particular case, and I don't want to use this one. I just go into a kind of a hypothetical, is evil things that have happened in the past. We know what they were. There's not a rule that says we can't learn from them or figure out a moral way to do them. Now, some things that are just flat out evil, you're never going to figure out a moral way to do it. That is true. But in terms of, take example of governing a society or something, we have seen prior civilizations in the past, how they've done it, and we're able to say this part was wrong and this part was right. This is something we can emulate. This is something that we should not. So just because someone in the past did some form of research that was wrong, the results that came out of it, I don't think should inherently be thrown out. We just need to figure out a way to do them correctly. So I guess that's kind of my example of what I'm going for. So if you would take an environmentalist perspective on the issue of oil, we figured out how to use oil, how to make cars go fast, and for a long time it was great until we realized this pollution was getting bad. Well, cars themselves are not inherently evil. We just need to figure out a way to make them less polluting, and eventually technology caught up and figured that out. So I wanted to just make that statement and just back check it to make sure it's right, because we can learn from people who did things wrong, and that's how we do it right. And I just want to, like I said, make sure that that's not something me steering people astray.
No, that's right. We have to, we have to take all of these things into account and be conscientious about it. It's just such a danger when, as you said, our society is so anemic to nuance and wants these kind of simplistic answers. And the fact is, these are serious issues that we need to spend some time reflecting on and looking into and discussing as you're helping us do today.
Yes, and like I said, it's in this particular case of the corona vaccine, it hasn't happened yet, so we don't know all of these details. I just wanted to have a chance as this becomes more probable, and like I said, it's pretty much in my mind is switched from a question of if to now just a question of when. That what are we going to do with it when it comes, and certainly you have outlined some simple facts that from the government standpoint they did allow us to deny taking certain medications, but the states also have their rights of saying you're not allowed to do this service, that service, or the other. And where the question will pop up is effectively they can turn off so many services that realistically you can't live and have a choice. In the world of education, you can figure out, online services, learning from home or something like that. But if you're not allowed to effectively live within the economy and, go get groceries, now you're into a situation where do you even have a choice? And when the and I guess this is kind of where the potential could go when the mob is essentially forcing you to go in this direction. Um, is it something that is worth or something that we should fight individually on moral ground? And from a theoretical standpoint, I think that that's the core of the theological question I'm trying to ask you today is if that's the situation, what is our obligation? Do we go with the crowd even though it's not something that might be morally we're on board with as an individual, but it will make the rest of our life dramatically easier? Or do we stand up and deal with potentially crippling consequences?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's that's the that's the tension for sure. And it depends on, the severity. Again, as I mentioned, the moral analysis is often not black and white, and um working through, what's really involved. I mean, we're sort of morally compromised all over the place in terms of, we contribute, we pay taxes, and our tax money is used to fund abortions in other countries. That's, I think, less the case in the Trump regime than it was in the Obama regime, or, in the Republicans as opposed to the Democrats. But, we're contributing money to things indirectly that are a mess. So, um, absolute moral purity is not an option for living in this society. So we have to look a little more carefully. And I had forgotten, it occurred to me in the meantime, there were some issues about COVID vaccines also being developed with fetal stem cell lines from aborted fetal tissue that came out in March or April. They were trying to really push this thing through, and then even claiming that bioethicists were okay with that. And of course, we're not okay with that. So you can't kill in order to save. You can't intentionally end one life in order to save another life. And killing infants in the womb in order to produce vaccines is just simply immoral. And it doesn't matter how inconvenient the government makes our lives, that's never acceptable, and it's never something that we can do. So now again, there are some uh, stem cell lines, or there are some vaccines that were developed from fetal tissue a long time ago. Those, they don't keep reusing, they don't keep doing new abortions. There are things that were already developed that are in existence. Uh, anyway, it gets a little bit complicated there too, but they were moving in that direction. They were actively developing vaccines using aborted fetal tissue, and so there was an absolute resistance to that. And from what I understand, a different decision was made because of that resistance. And that's the kind of thing that we have to do in terms of our moral behavior. It's, if we don't stand up for infants in the womb, they can't speak for themselves, and that's the kind of thing. People who are compromised, people who are silenced, people who don't have the power to resist. Uh, we have to be a voice for them, and stand with them on some of these issues. I know, and that's where different legal firms, or those who have some power, who have some influence, if everybody just sort of falls over and says, "Well, I guess everybody's doing it," then we end up in all kinds of disastrous situations. So yeah, I think it's something that we need to summon a little bit of moral fortitude, and prepare to make good decisions, and even to suffer for those decisions.
Yeah, and as you go to the prior episode we just did was on the importance of suffering from time to time, and this is certainly a situation where you can't really say there's more the moral high ground than that. Turning an individual into a product, if you look at it from that standpoint, has been universally wrong throughout history and throughout always. And that is essentially what they're doing with the aborted fetuses here. They're turning it into a supply for a product. So that is something that is fundamentally wrong and something that is worth diving into the nuances of and reading more than just the headlines. So we thank everyone for listening with us here today. And then obviously, as these types of situations go more from the down the road to the now, we will discuss these types of conversations again. So
And if I could just point our listeners to a website, I mentioned people who have done better moral analyses than I can do off the top of my, well, than I could do ever probably, but certainly off the top of my head. The National Catholic Bioethics Center, NCBC, is excellent and has a lot of, has podcasts and articles, blogs, uh, publications, courses. They have a lot of things available. The website is ncbcenter.org, ncbcenter.org. And you find a lot there. And I just did a quick search for COVID-19 vaccine, and there's a ton of stuff. So for anybody who really wants to look into that more deeply, I just really recommend that.
perfect. And again, we thank everyone for listening, and we'll be with you again here next week.